When we think about films based on books, we usually imagine massive novels like The Lord of the Rings, Dune, and Harry Potter, huge stories that are hundreds of pages long. But sometimes, some of the most iconic films ever made come from something much smaller: a 10-page short story, a magazine article, sometimes even just a single idea published in a science fiction magazine. In fact, some of the greatest films in history were inspired by stories so short you could read them in one sitting. So in this video, we're looking at short stories that were turned into movies, from sci-fi masterpieces to cult classics, and seeing how filmmakers transform tiny pieces of fiction into full-length films. Let's start with Memento, one of the most famous examples. Christopher Nolan's breakthrough film was inspired by the short story Memento Mori, written by his brother Jonathan Nolan and published in Esquire magazine in 2001. The story is only around 25 pages long, and it follows a man with anterograde amnesia who cannot form new memories and must rely on notes and tattoos to hunt the man who killed his wife. Nolan turned this relatively small story into a groundbreaking film starring Guy Pearce, using the now famous reverse narrative structure. The movie became a critical sensation and is now widely considered one of the most innovative thrillers of the 2000s. But interestingly, the film actually changes the story significantly. In the original short story, the protagonist is confined to a mental institution, while the film expands the narrative into a larger mystery. Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey was inspired by Arthur C. Clarke's 1951 short story, The Sentinel. The story is only about 8 pages long and revolves around the discovery of a mysterious alien artifact buried on the moon. Kubrick and Clarke took this single idea and expanded it into an epic exploration of human evolution, artificial intelligence, and extraterrestrial intelligence. The film, starring Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood, became one of the most influential movies ever made, winning the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects and reshaping science fiction cinema forever. Another fascinating example is 1968's The Swimmer. The film is based on John Cheever's famous short story, first published in The New Yorker in 1964. The original story is roughly 9 pages long and follows a suburban man who decides to swim home through every swimming pool in his neighbourhood. What starts as a whimsical journey slowly becomes something darker and more surreal. The film adaptation starred Burt Lancaster and stayed surprisingly faithful to the short story's tone and symbolism. Over time, the film has developed a somewhat cult classic status, praised for its strange, dreamlike portrayal of suburban American life. One of the best modern sci-fi films also began as a short story. Denis Villeneuve's Arrival was adapted from Ted Chiang's short story, Story of Your Life. The original story is about 40 pages long and focuses heavily on language and communication. The film, starring Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner, expands the story into a global alien contact thriller while keeping its central philosophical idea intact. Arrival received 8 Oscar nominations and won for Best Sound Editing, becoming one of the most respected sci-fi films of the last decade. Another famous example comes from F. Scott Fitzgerald. His short story, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, published back in 1922, is about a man who ages backwards. The original story is only around 26 pages long, but David Fincher's film adaptation turned it into a sprawling historical epic starring Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett. The film received 13 Academy Award nominations and won 3 Oscars, including for Best Visual Effects. David Cronenberg's body horror classic The Fly also began as a short story. The original story, by George Langelaan, was published in Playboy magazine in 1957 and is only about 32 pages long. While Cronenberg's version wasn't the first adaptation, his film starring Jeff Goldblum and Geena Davis is highly regarded as one of the defining films of the decade, and it expanded the premise of the short story dramatically. The film was widely praised for its groundbreaking special effects and remains one of the greatest horror films ever made. Even one of the most beloved Christmas movies of all time began as a short story. Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life was based on The Greatest Gift by Philip Van Doren Stern. The story was originally written in 1939 and sent as a Christmas card to friends before eventually being adapted into the classic film starring James Stewart. Despite initially disappointing box office results, the film later became one of the most iconic movies in American cinema. Steven Spielberg's Minority Report came from a short story written by Philip K. Dick in 1956. The story is only about 32 pages long and revolves around a future where crimes can be predicted before they happen. Spielberg's film starring Tom Cruise expanded the world significantly, turning the story into a large-scale futuristic thriller. The film became a critical and commercial success instantly. One of the most influential films ever made also began as a short story. Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon is based on 2 short stories by Japanese writer Ryunosuke Akutagawa from 1922, particularly In a Grove. The original story is extremely short, roughly 14 pages long, and revolves around the investigation of a murder in a forest. What makes the story unique is that the crime is described by multiple witnesses, each giving a completely different version of what happened. Kurosawa expanded this idea into the 1950 film Rashomon, starring Toshiro Mifune, which became famous for its fractured narrative structure. The film was a huge international success and won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, introducing Japanese cinema to global audiences. The storytelling technique became so influential that the term the Rashomon effect is now widely used to describe situations where different people recall the same event in contradictory ways. Another fascinating example is Blow Up, directed by Michelangelo Antonioni. The film is based on a short story by Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar titled Las Babas del Diablo, which translates roughly to The Devil's Drool. The original story is about 16 pages long and follows a photographer who believes he has accidentally captured evidence of a crime in one of his photographs. Antonioni's adaptation moves the story from Paris to 1960s London, placing it right in the middle of the swinging London cultural explosion. The film starred David Hemmings and Vanessa Redgrave and became one of the defining films of the decade. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and is often cited as one of the most important art films ever made. Interestingly, Antonioni's version dramatically expands the themes of the short story, turning it into a meditation on perception, reality, and the limits of photography. Another great example comes from Daphne du Maurier, the author of Rebecca. Her short story, Don't Look Now, is about 56 pages long and follows a couple mourning the death of their daughter while travelling through Venice. The 1973 film adaptation, directed by Nicholas Roeg, starred Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie. Pauline Kael called this film the fanciest, most carefully assembled enigma yet put on the screen. Nicholas Roeg is a chillingly chic director. The picture is an example of high-fashion gothic sensibility. Using du Maurier as a base, Roeg comes closer to getting Borgia on the screen than those who have tried it directly, but there's a distasteful clamminess about the picture. Roeg's style is in love with disintegration. The film stays fairly close to the tone of the original story, but expands its psychological tension and visual symbolism. Upon release, it shocked audiences with its unsettling atmosphere and one of the most famous plot twists in horror cinema. Today, Don't Look Now is widely regarded as one of the greatest psychological thrillers ever made. Even one of the most celebrated films in Hollywood history began as a short story. In the mid-1940s, Mary Orr, then a young actress, sold a short story titled The Wisdom of Eve, based on a true story apparently related to her by the actress Elizabeth Bergner, whose assistant tried to steal her career, to Cosmopolitan for around $800. It was optioned by 20th Century Fox for about $5,000 and was eventually developed into a screenplay written by Joseph Mankiewicz, who, according to Sam Staggs, writing about the film in Vanity Fair, kept not a single line of dialogue from Mary Orr's story, but he did retain what served him better, the breezy, brittle tone. And it worked. In 1950, All About Eve won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Director, Best Picture, and Best Screenplay. The original short story is relatively brief, around 9 pages long, and tells the tale of a young aspiring actress who manipulates her way into the life of an established stage star. The movie starred Bette Davis, Anne Baxter, and George Sanders, and became one of the most acclaimed films of the classic Hollywood era. Finally, one of the most interesting examples, The Killers. The film was based on a short story by Ernest Hemingway, originally published in 1927. The story itself is incredibly short, only about 11 pages, and follows 2 hitmen who arrive in a small town looking for a man known as the Swede. The fascinating thing is that the short story only covers the opening scene of the later films. The first adaptation came in 1946, directed by Robert Siodmak and starring Burt Lancaster and Ava Gardner. The filmmakers took the short opening scenario and built an entire film noir narrative around it. Then, in 1964, another adaptation was made, which reimagined the story again, starring Lee Marvin, John Cassavetes, Angie Dickinson, and Ronald Reagan in his last film role. There's even a short film adaptation by legendary Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky that sticks closely to Hemingway's original text. It's a perfect example of how filmmakers can take a tiny fragment of a short story and expand it into something much larger. Looking at all these examples, it becomes clear that short stories offer something incredibly valuable to filmmakers, a powerful idea that can be expanded in almost limitless ways. All of the films started with something incredibly small, a short story, a magazine article, sometimes just a single idea, and yet filmmakers were able to transform these small pieces of fiction into entire cinematic worlds, which just proves something interesting about storytelling. Sometimes the shortest stories can inspire the biggest movies.